Now, we're going to talk today a bit about knowledge, about powerful
Yeah.
knowledge, about curriculum issues. And I just want to start off with something which could open up all sorts of nests of vipers or worms or whatever. And that is, what do you mean by the word knowledge?
Well, I mean, as with so many words like that, um, it's a contextual question because, in fact, uh, I have some knowledge which enables me to bake a loaf or something like that. But in fact, that's a very particular notion of knowledge. I have some knowledge that, in fact, I know the name of the street I live in, you know, and so you can't ask. There's no general thing about knowledge, but um, what I mean, I think I'd rather talk about knowledge in education, and that in fact, and that in a sense is embodied by the curriculum, because the curriculum, in a sense, whether it's a curriculum, a national curriculum or curriculum at school, it actually says this is the worthwhile knowledge that we want our students to have by the time they leave. And sadly, very often they don't. And so I'm interested in that notion of knowledge, the knowledge that can be accessible to kids going through school.
Right.
And I think that's important to stress. And in a sense, it's got to be as true as it can be within the limits of what they know and what the teachers know, and that's really important. That notion of truth, because in fact, if you're actually not actually telling it as you know, then in a sense you're not being a teacher.
Right. You see, it's a very simple answer to a very simple question. And already we've opened up all sorts of ideas, truth for being one of them. Look, I'm going to plug away at this a bit more. Perhaps you're making the emphasis on what is taught at school, perhaps more sacred than the profane knowledge that the everyday knowledge we get in our own lives. So perhaps that's it. Powerful knowledge, then. Now, powerful knowledge, which is what you're known for, often gets conflated with cultural capital, both the Ofsted version and the Bourdieu version, cultural literacy, the E.D. Hirsch idea, and even the best that's been thought and said, the Matthew Arnold idea, which is enshrined in our national curriculum. Now, are all these things basically the same, or are you sort of ploughing a different furrow?
I think I am playing a different furrow because it's important to realise that in fact, um, the where this idea of powerful knowledge, because in one sense, it's not a new idea. Of course, everybody knows that some knowledge enables them to do things and some doesn't. And some knowledge is important for passing exams and some isn't. So, I mean, everybody knows it, what that notion of powerful knowledge. But I started because I spent most of my career teaching in the sociology of education, and then for quite a long period, I worked in the area of vocational education. And in a sense, in both of these, I got increasingly worried that in fact we were talking about education, but not focusing on what the purposes of that education were, which was to give access to the best knowledge we can in whatever area we're studying. So, best knowledge has a different meaning in, say, doing a vocational course to become some kind of craftsman or technician than it does if you're trying to get an A level to get into university, or if you're trying to, in a sense, develop your capacity as a primary school student to become literate and to develop a capacity to read and write. And those are also knowledge also involved. So knowledge is about that. That's what powerful knowledge says. That in fact there is some really valuable knowledge, not truth in the absolute sense, that in fact should actually be embodied in the curriculum. And that in fact that is an important focus of thinking about what goes on in in classrooms and in schools.
Okay, well, let's perhaps get specific about it. If I was talking about, I don't know, cultural capital or the best that's been thought and said, and thinking of a science curriculum, it would be pretty similar to the science curriculum I think that Powerful Knowledge would come up with. Is that right?
Yeah, but I think where we came from, where we came from, and when I wrote my book, Bringing Knowledge Back In, that I think was what became the influential academic book, if you like, when we came from, we were saying that in a sense, knowledge is everybody's right. And we have a school system which, in fact, doesn't ensure that a large number of kids actually do have access to that knowledge. And we have all kinds of things for interpreting that. We decide they're not able, we decide that something like that. We may even decide that we should do things like the RSA's opening minds, that we should open them up and give them, not just keep them in the school, but in fact give them time outside. But of course, you give them time outside, what they're doing is not learning what they might learn in school. And, and I've always wanted to emphasize the importance of what kids could learn in school, and in particular in relation to what kids could acquire through studying subjects. And the crucial thing in relation to the curriculum is that it actually gives access to knowledge through subjects. And
Okay.
that, in a sense, is my notion of powerful knowledge, whether it's chemistry, because I used to be a chemistry teacher before I became a sociologist.
Now, if we are talking about subjects, this is something which is now enshrined, I expect, throughout the education system since the Michael Gove reforms. Are you a fan of Gove?
I'm not a fan of Gove, no, because in fact um, Gove saw having a subject-based curriculum as, in a sense, establishing a fixed body of knowledge that, in fact, some kids would succeed and some wouldn't. So that, in fact, it's not that I think that there's anything necessarily wrong with the knowledge that people in the public schools get access to. What is wrong is that it's actually access to only access to them. That's the key thing. The key thing is the question of access, not just a question of powerful knowledge. Just says there is some important knowledge. It's not the special privilege of some kids. It's the right of all kids. And somehow or other, we have to develop an education system that makes that possible. And subjects are the best way that schools can do, because they take kids away from their everyday knowledge and give them a chance to, in fact, have access to knowledge that is actually powerful. And what I mean by powerful there is I mean that it enables them to think beyond their experience and not just be trapped by it.
Right. So is that basic? I mean, was it Gateskill who said a grammar school's, a comprehensive school should be a grammar school for everyone, a grammar school for all, if you like. Is it knowledge of the powerful for all?
Knowledge of the powerful is a complete not it's really important to make this distinction between powerful knowledge and knowledge of the powerful.
Hmm.
Powerful knowledge says something about knowledge, that it's organized, it's specialized, it's organized into subjects, and it's often hard work and tough to learn. But nevertheless, it's the best knowledge there is, and everybody has the right to it. That's what powerful knowledge is about. Knowledge of the powerful is actually focuses on who the powerful are and who is in the position to decide who gets the knowledge and who doesn't. So knowledge of the powerful is, in a sense, a kind of political rather than educational concept. And it's really important. One of the problems I had would take issue with about Gove is not. I mean, his concept of powerful knowledge was rather old-fashioned. I think that, for instance, much as I admire Matthew Arnold, his view of the best that been thought and said was primarily the classics, because that was his time. Now, the classics is no basis for powerful knowledge in our time, even if it was them. So, in fact, what Gove didn't want to do, because after all, he was Secretary of State of a Conservative government. What he didn't want to do was to, in fact, recognize that if you want a curriculum based upon powerful knowledge, then you've got to have the resources to be able to do it. You've got to have the resources, the highly qualified teachers. You've got to have the resources in the labs and studios and things like that, the land for PE and all kinds of things that is in fact only in a very few schools. There's an enormous difference, for instance, between the per pupil funding of the average state school and the per pupil funding of the public schools where the parents pay £35,000 a year for their pupils, their children to be at school.
Is it the perhaps I don't know whether to go with this idea. Would you abolish public schools, by the way?
Well, I was at one, and in a sense, I wasn't unhappy there. But I have come to realize that, in fact, if you have a public system that enables the wealthy and the powerful to opt out of it and develop their own system, you're never going to get, as you do in Finland, a school system where there aren't any private schools, where, in fact, the accountants and the businessmen and the heads of Nokia and things like that have to use the same schools as the guy who's sweeping your road down the road. And then you get a completely different kind of system. So, in fact, I contend there's absolutely no case. There are a lot of complications for actually what you do with the existing ones, but there's no case for private education.
There
No,
you are.
no educational, no democratic case.
Right. There might be a freedom of choice case, perhaps, or
There might be a freedom of choice case, but there's certain things I think, and we think that the National Health Service should in fact be a treatment without pay at the point of treatment. We could actually have the same thing about education, because if you find you've got cancer and you need an operation that costs £100,000 to see you through, then you still get it on the National Health Service, whether or not you've got £100,000. If you don't, if you go to the United States, then the first thing they do when you get to the hospital is to ask for your credit card. That is a different that. So I mean, I think that's the parallel I would draw.
so a more egalitarian system. You wrote
Yes, so it must be
yeah,
it must be a more egalitarian system of access. It
yeah.
must be.
Now, you've written recently the purpose of schooling is not to impose one culture on children, but to be the opportunity for them to access knowledge and reach for the universal. Now, could you, I mean, these days when people are talking about decentering the curriculum, decolonization of the curriculum diversity, is the universal even there anymore? Or do we have to think basically about different cultures, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of living in it, different forms of art, of literature, perhaps even science as well, for that matter? Some people have called for that. Or is there a case for a universal idea that we should teach all with that in mind?
I think there is a case for a common curriculum uh, for all, and in a sense, and it depends an awful lot which subject area you're talking about, to what extent how that is interpreted. I don't think there's any case for a kind of culturally specific mathematics or physics or chemistry or biology. I don't think there's any case for that at all. Um, in a sense, where there is a case is in fact in area. Obviously, we give some recognition of that in relation to religion, not so much in relation to history and literature. But in fact, what that means about a common curriculum is going to vary across different subjects. But I do think there is something universal about access to knowledge in any field, which is actually about truth an integrity in terms of what you're learning and taking your learning as far as you can, given what you already know. And that shouldn't be distributed. That's all. And I also think that, in a sense, a public education, it's very important that people actually get access to, if you like, that common knowledge.
And when you draw the line here, are we drawing a national boundary around this, a local boundary, or even a world
Well,
curriculum? I mean,
it's a good question. I think that on the one hand, um, if you have a literature syllabus or a history syllabus, it's going to be different in France than in England, and it should be because the history of France is different from the history of England. So I mean, and the literatures of France are different than the literatures of England. And similarly in truth, the difference in relation to Scotland. So, so it's going to have those boundaries. The other boundaries that it's going to have is in relation to the school. That in fact the school will be in part local, and the school will have to interpret that curriculum, that common curriculum, in relation to where it's at and who its students are, and so forth. And so, I mean, I think that there are both those things.
now obviously in
But I
terms of,
don't.
go on.
Sorry.
No, go on.
No, go on. No, no. I just think that the issue, uh, um, it's it's a complex issue. How, I mean, I wouldn't claim to be a sort of specialist in the field in relation to, for instance, the debate about decolonization. Um, and it is really important that, for instance, that uh, students learn about the fact that our industrialization and the fact that we are now, believe it or not, the fifth or something sixth richest country in the world was largely dependent upon an empire where we exploited the resources and the labor of other people rather than to their benefit. Now, it's really, really important that, in fact, people in this country learn about that. Um, and I think that that would be part of a common curriculum.
Yeah, I think
And that
this
was
is.
how I would.
I think this is part of the difficulty here, isn't it? Is that, I mean, for Hirsch, he talks about the common culture of the tribe, if you like, and the tribe has to educate its young into the way that the tribe behaves
Right.
and what it values. Now, if the tribe is clearly something that's static and stays the same year upon year, never does it move out of its area or invade other areas or bring people into it, then it's an easier thing to talk about than one that's has more movement, that does invade other countries, that does allow immigration from people from other tribes, and I'm using Hirschian terms here. So when we have a mixed culture, that things are moving, can we actually have something that conserves culture, or should it always be up to date knowledge that we teach? And it's
Well, I think it's. I think first of all, there's no neat answer to those kind of issues. I mean, take the example that always comes home to me is I spent a lot of time in the 90s working in South Africa, and there was one of the debates that went on then was about the debate about vernacular languages, and there were some people who argued very strongly there were 12 different national languages in South Africa, and quite a lot of linguistic specialists argue it was very important to allow uh, students to learn in their vernacular. Now, the problem about that is, well, there are two problems. One is that, in fact, as you grow up, you come across the fact you're doing some specialist subject like physics, and there isn't a literature, there isn't a research tradition in physics. So what do if you haven't actually learned the language that equips you in relation to that later? And what what they found in South Africa was that there was a divide between, if you like, some of the linguistic specialists and the parents of the kids who knew that what was going to be important for their kids is that they would actually be fluent in English, which was not the vernacular. And in fact, and so there's a kind of there's no neat sorting out of that. As long as you've got a divided and unequal society, as you have in South Africa, you're going to have to actually find some kind of tricky compromise.
Well, of course, and perhaps in our society, that is very much on the lines of class. And that does bring us back to the knowledge of the powerful. Inevitably, should we learn Shakespeare, Latin, the classics, etc., alongside the sciences, alongside that? Or should we be looking at a wider pool and perhaps, in a Raymond Williams sense of a common culture, bring in folk culture, more working class cultures, though he doesn't use those terms, but a more folk culture? That what is English or British or these strange sort of unifying ideas? Or is it
I think
basically
the
knowledge of the powerful?
I think that it's a really tricky question about class culture, but it seemed to me that in a sense you could argue that class is a position that in fact some people find themselves in. It's not some kind of fixed thing, and that in fact it um, if you go back to the 18th century, then Shakespeare wasn't just an elite thing done at the National Theatre and so forth with a very restricted class access to it. It was actually a much more, the elite didn't go to Shakespeare. It was actually quite less well off, less people who went to Shakespeare. So in a sense, these things change. Just as in fact, there are these great literary traditions in somewhere like Russia, where in fact Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and people were actually part of what all kinds of people who maybe just work on the farm, but they still read Tolstoy or something like that. So I think it's one has to be quite careful historically about that. And I certainly wouldn't want to treat class in that way. Class is a question about access. And access is a question about giving as broad an access as you can to everyone in relation to and also in relation to, for instance, the sciences. Well, there's nothing class specific about physics. It's a public. It's where the society has got in understanding the world. That's the access should be to anyone and everyone. It shouldn't. It's not a class thing. And so I think it's really important to make those kind of distinctions.
Yeah, which opens up the relationship between the person who knows something and what is known, and about whether that relationship is a one-way relationship. Here's something you don't know, now you know it. That's made you a better person. Or is there something about it that we try and find ourselves through the knowledge we accrue over time? What to you is the importance of the relationship between the two, not just knowledge but the knower?
Well, the knower is I mean, we're all students about something and knowledge about other things, and it's a question of the context we're in. Which of the things that we're a knower about we want to become more of a knower about, and in a sense, the things that we are a student about or not, and so forth. So I mean, it's and also there's a question if you happen to be somebody who knows quite a lot, who's actually had that's because they've had the opportunity to have access to that knowledge, and therefore the question is about the responsibility to those who don't. And the responsibility involves one, the question I mentioned before, access, and the other, equally important, is the question of respect. That in a sense, it's really important if you're going to encourage people to want to know more, to actually respect who they are, regardless of what they know. And that's an important part of pedagogy.
How much should I alter the curriculum to reflect the knower in front of me. I mean, some people argue for complete personalization, for example. Other people,
Curriculum doesn't. The curriculum shouldn't reflect the knower at all. The curriculum is something you have that knowers have access to. That's what they go to school. We have schools to give people access to something. We don't. If you were ferreting in the knower, you wouldn't need schools because they could just, in fact, I mean, centuries earlier, knower pupils, young people were growing up. They were developing knowledge, and in fact, they were in a kind of way knowers, but they didn't actually. There was no specialization. Specialization is the absolutely crucial issue, I think. That in fact we want. We're in a world where we want. You know, if you take something like climate change, if you were going to actually tackle climate change, we have to have many more knowledgeable people about why climate is going to destroy our planet.
and when it comes to choices of literature and history, I mean, you've mentioned about history earlier. Let's say the choices classically were the Nazis in history and the Tudors, let's say. And people sort of pushing it now, we should teach empire and colonialism to give a more rounded education, but also to reflect the fact that we have people of colour in the classroom who come from ex-colonies, etc., etc. Why am I here? Being the question for them, perhaps. Why am I in this classroom in this town at this precise minute? How did I get here? It's a question that Sundar Katwala put to me about his education, where he said that in history he found he wasn't there at all. The Noah wasn't reflected in the curriculum in history or in literature. Those important things, surely.
They're very important things, but I think it relates to an issue that I've always felt was important too, and that is that in fact I'm not. I have personal views about what people should know. I've got certain specialist knowledge as being a sociologist and a university professor, and I actually have to go to another group of specialists who know about things like what's best to teach kids history over the period of their growing up. And I mean, one of the best examples that I came across was an article about kids who were learning, who were studying the 15th, 16th century, I think it was, 16th century, the time of the Reformation, and the teacher had got hold of some parish records, and the whole debate about the reforms, switching backwards and forwards between Catholic and Anglican and so forth, that came out of the lived lives of people during that time. And so you got kids who were not necessarily academic, who were actually understanding what concepts like heresy. Now, they probably never heard of heresy before, but that was really important to understand, because it was enabled them to understand, in a sense, things about where we are today, because the Reformation has a big influence on where we are today. So I certainly wouldn't want to, but that's something that, if you like, the specialist history teacher, and the book I sent you, the ebook of, in fact, is written mostly about specialist history teachers thinking about their teaching in school. But they happen to be interested in some of the work that I do about knowledge. But I don't know about the content. You couldn't put me into a biology class or into geography class and for me to have views about what they. All I know is that in fact, at whatever age pupils are, you want to give them the best access to biology or geography or whatever it may be that you can at the limits of how old they are and what they have known before. That's why I'm very keen, and I do think it's important to understand why subjects are important, because if you break subjects down, you have no boundaries between knowledge and so forth, then in fact kids never really know what they know. They never really know whether they're progressing to know more knowledge.
Yeah, one subject you know a lot about, of course, is the teaching of education. Now, is that a fraught area? I mean, it has been in the past, and certainly you've written about it before. What should
It's a
be on
very,
the
it's a very,
education curriculum at a university, teaching teachers how to teach? What should be central to the ITT curriculum, do you think?
it's a very fraught and tricky subject, and obviously I have thought a lot about it. But on the whole, what I my role has been to I worked on the assumption that it's important for teachers to have some access to the disciplines that inform our education system. And therefore, they came to classes of mine or lectures of mine, or I supervised students and so forth in the sociology of education. And that's a very particular part. And in a sense, it's part of, if you like, the educational knowledge that we want our teachers to have when they're going to when they're going into the classroom. In the same way that, in fact, if you've got a qualified doctor, you don't want them to become biochemists or physiologists, but you want them to have studied biochemistry and physiology so that they can actually engage in their practice as doctors. And I want them to study philosophy, history, and psychology and sociology of education so they can actually better understand what it involves to be a teacher.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about people knowing things in pedagogy around. Sorry, my printer has suddenly started printing. I don't know quite why that is, but anyway, probably a new tome is being written as we speak. But in terms of pedagogy, we have a lot of movement now towards direct instruction in schools. That schools should be teaching various things around memory, um, so cognitive science approaches. Doug Lemoff, I think, is someone that perhaps you've come across as well, and Rosenshine is all the rage now. In terms of pedagogy, the actual teaching of the knowledge, do you have anything to say on that? Is it something you don't mind at all, the way things are taught, or do you think that reflects very much on the philosophy of education of an institution and indeed the philosophy
I,
of knowledge?
I think that uh, there are two things that are really important that I kind of feel I know about, um, and the others all areas of debate. The things that are really important. One I've spoken about, that there should be a sense, whatever teachers are doing, there should be a sense of progressing towards better, more truthful, truer knowledge in whatever field that the kid is learning in. That, and it's not knowledge that makes them happy, that makes life easier, it's anything like that. And it's going to be tough, and the teacher has to work with those kids to actually make that progress. So that's the curriculum side. The pedagogic side is much more problematic, I think, in many ways. And that is actually about the fact that once you get, and this is something I learned from when I got excited about reading the Russian psychologist Vygotsky, that in fact, when kids get to school, that they're only going to learn if they choose to learn. They actually have to, it's a voluntary act. Before, if you don't go to school, you learn anyway while you're doing other things. Once you get to school, you have to decide that you are going to learn and therefore and get involved in your learning. And the teacher's job has to be to build on that basis. I think that the basis that in fact the learning is done by the pupil, not by what the teacher does. All the teacher can do is to place in context the opportunity to learn. That's why all these sort of cognitive psychology things I'm very, very skeptical about memory. I really am. I think the important thing is you don't have a problem with memory if, in fact, you know what you want to learn. You actually work on it to the next thing. And I think that's really, and I think that, I mean, I once came across I haven't read much of him, the French psychologist Jacques Lacan. One of the things he said was, in fact, he argued from his own experience and research, was that in fact people are born with a desire to not desire for knowledge. But what happens is that they lose the desire, and somehow or other we either have to help we have to help them to maintain to keep that desire right the way through schooling. And if so, then in a sense, an awful lot of other things fall into place, provided you've actually got a reliable curriculum.
Right. Okay. So, in terms of direct instruction and those things, you sort of saying you have some questions about it, perhaps some doubts about it. In terms of the philosophy of that idea, if I've got some knowledge, and I mean, it's almost a deficit model, perhaps, that the child hasn't got that knowledge. I think it's important for them to have this bit of knowledge, and it might be physics, it might be Shakespeare, it might be art, it might be music, whatever it is. And I need them to want that knowledge as well as teach it. How can I square that circle if they don't want to, if they don't care, if they really have no education in their family,
Well,
perhaps no respect towards it? Are they just going to throw it back in
I
my
think
face?
it goes back to that notion of desire. And the guy who the researcher who I most respect, actually contemporary one in this area, is a French guy, Bernard Charlot. And he focuses on the question that, in fact, uh, students need to develop a relationship to the knowledge, and everything that a teacher does must be organized around two things. One is the reliability of the knowledge, and the second is the pupil developing a relationship to it, so that you don't just teach them about valency if you're teaching chemistry, but you enable them to see why valency matters to them, and that in fact you have to work that through whatever subject that you're teaching. And I think that's the notion of desire I mentioned, a notion of developing a relationship to knowledge. Because once a pupil has got a relationship to knowledge, then the issues of memory and all those disappear. That doesn't mean the teacher doesn't have a lot of hard work to do in terms of that, but they actually have to do that. And I think another reason why I think subject teaching is so important is, and certainly this is from my own personal experience as well, and that is that in fact, if a teacher is excited and enthusiastic, whether it's literature or history or chemistry, then they part of the communication they have with their pupils is that excitement, and that they are as interested in the pupil developing a, an exciting relationship to that knowledge as the one that they have. And in the end, what you want your pupils to do is to be as excited and as you are. And in a sense, I've found that it's not all that different when you're supervising a doctoral student. When my doctoral students graduate and they go off and they do something else, I feel quite sad, because I want them to continue having the same kind of excitement that I have.
It's interesting listening to you there. There's a new university opening in London called the London Interdisciplinary School that's looking at the idea of breaking down the barriers between subjects. Not saying that there isn't a place for subjects in secondary school, but coming on from secondary school into university, looking at a wide range of breaking down the barriers, looking for connections across disciplines. And is that something which might excite you, or do you think it's on a hiding to nothing?
Well, I think I think two two things really that are worth stressing. There are two kind of basic boundaries we engage with as teachers. One is the boundary between the knowledge kids come to school with and the knowledge they experience in subjects, because the world is not like subjects at all. The world is uh, the world is quite different, and kids will have a quite different relationship to what they know. That they've got to actually some of the researchers have used the term disruption to describe what happens to kids when they're at school. They're going to have to disrupt their previous knowledge and understanding in making that move. That's one aspect that I wanted to stress. The other one is the interdisciplinary. I'm not against interdisciplinary studies or interdisciplinary research or anything like that. What I think is that it is not helpful to the student to get involved in interdisciplinary inquiry unless they already have fair development in the disciplines that they want to go beyond. If you come up against the limits of your chemistry and you find you have to do something in biology or in history, that is fine. But it's to have some kind of historical chemics as some kind of subject that doesn't have any history, any community, any area group of specialists or anything, I don't think that's a winner at all. And so I don't agree with the idea of interdisciplinary. I think it's something that, in a sense, you can work towards because you've actually found the limits of the subjects that you've studied.
And does that go in the other direction if I go into primary school, junior school, infant school even? When should I start teaching subjects?
Well, in primary school, you're focusing more on the relationship between what kids come to, the experience they have, and I mean, I think there's a very realistic division in terms of specialization. Again, I can't stress the word enough that I have an enormous respect for my primary teacher colleagues, but in fact, they engage in a quite different thing to what I gauged both when I was a school teacher of chemistry and when I was a university teacher of sociology. Then in the latter, I was a specialist. In the primary school ones, not. And I think that the issues are very different. I don't think there's one thing to apply for all.
Right. Now, coming to the end of a fascinating interview, Michael. So I'm going to ask you one question. I'm going to give you the chance to be Education Secretary for one day only, but you can bring in as a policy or two, if you like, that will have to last forever. So if you had ultimate power, just one day, what would you bring in?
I think I would bring in I would have a lot of confidence in my existing teachers and curriculum, and I would bring in a model of a progressive model of funding that, in fact, they would be able to call on in the years ahead, progressively year by year, because they are all desperately underfunded at the moment, and that they can't really do as much as even they can do now with that funding. And that's what I would like to see. I would like to see the improved conditions for learning rather than in some kind of education policy.
That's brilliant, Michael. If only we could, eh? If only we could. You never know. There
Indeed,
seems
indeed.
it's funny how the magic money tree wasn't there, then suddenly it is there. So
Um,
perhaps there are some occasions when the taps could be certainly rolling out. What comes out?
I
What
mean,
comes out of a tap?
I don't mean that money. I don't mean that money is the only thing at all. I mean that resources to make sense,
Yep.
to make good choices, and that in a sense there's going to be constraints, professional expertise, and all kinds of things that spend it. I mean that. But in fact, you have to have the resources to be able to make the choices. In a sense, that's what I'm saying.
And is there anything you'd like to add about anything we've talked about? Your last chance.
Um, oh, I think there are lots of things. Yeah. I mean, I guess, yes. I'd just like to say that, in fact, teacher education, and there's a lot of pressure from governments and so forth to push teacher education to make it a kind of craft apprenticeship model in the schools where you learn from senior teachers. That is a model for a craft, but it's not a model for a profession. Model for a profession needs to actually equip the pupil, the future teachers with specialist knowledge in the university, spend time interacting between the university and the school, and then becoming the full-time professional. That is the issue that is most concerning me at the moment, just today. And the other issue is the desperate degree of inequality across the whole system. I would really tackle that. I wouldn't just tackle it by abolishing the public schools, because that wouldn't suddenly generate a lot of money. But but I would find other ways of doing it.
It's nice to hear you being as radical as ever, Michael. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, albeit on this strange sort of online version. And it's a long time since we were in a pub together. I remember
You
supping,
were indeed. Well, we'll be one again soon, I hope.
hopefully soon. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, are we off? Are we offline now?
Not yet, just about to go. Hang on.
Right. Okay.